Patricia Krenwinkel, a figure synonymous with one of the most notorious crime sprees in American history, has once again been recommended for parole. This development involves a member of the infamous Manson family cult. The recommendation has predictably ignited significant outrage. This strong reaction comes particularly from the family of one of the victims, actress Sharon Tate. Krenwinkel holds a somber distinction. She is currently the longest-serving female inmate within the California correctional system. She is also one of only 2 remaining Manson family members who were convicted of the 1969 murders and remain incarcerated. The other is Leslie Van Houten, whose own parole recommendations have also faced significant opposition and gubernatorial review. The murders committed by the Manson family in the summer of 1969 sent shockwaves across the United States. They shattered a sense of security and innocence, becoming a dark symbol of the era's turmoil. Give a like and subscribe. Leave a comment. Patricia Krenwinkel is now 77 years old. Her life has been defined by the events of 1969 and the subsequent decades of incarceration. She was convicted in 1971. The conviction was for her direct role in the brutal murders of 7 people. These killings occurred over a terrifying 2-night period in August 1969. The events unfolded in 2 separate locations in Los Angeles. Krenwinkel was initially sentenced to death for her crimes. This was the standard penalty for such capital offenses at the time. However, her sentence was later commuted. This occurred after the California Supreme Court ruled the state's death penalty unconstitutional in 1972. Her sentence was changed to life in prison with the possibility of parole. Krenwinkel has now been incarcerated for 54 years. She has spent this extensive period at the California Institution for Women in Corona. The horrific murders were orchestrated by Charles Manson. Manson was the charismatic and manipulative leader of the cult known as the Manson Family. The first night of the killing spree targeted the home of actress Sharon Tate. Tate, who was 8 months pregnant, was murdered along with 4 of her friends who were visiting. The victims at the Tate residence were Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, and Stephen Parent. Parent was a young man who happened to be visiting the property's caretaker. The following night, the violence continued. Manson directed Krenwinkel and others to the home of grocery store executive Leno LaBianca and his wife Rosemary. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were also brutally murdered. These killings were seemingly more random than the Tate murders, chosen from a phone book according to some accounts. Though Manson had some prior connection to the area, Krenwinkel admitted her direct participation in the violence. Specifically, she confessed to stabbing Abigail Folger at the Tate residence. During her testimony, Krenwinkel described the attack on Folger. She stated that she stabbed Folger 28 times. She chillingly added that her hand throbbed from the exertion. Following the murders, Krenwinkel and other followers engaged in disturbing acts. They used the victims' blood to smear messages on the walls and doors of the homes. Messages such as "death to pigs" and "helter skelter," a misspelling of helter skelter, were written in blood. These acts were intended to be symbolic and provocative. The murders were part of Charles Manson's delusional and complex plot. He sought to ignite a race war, which he termed helter skelter. Manson believed this impending race war was foretold. He derived this belief from his interpretation of the Beatles' song Helter Skelter from their White Album. It is a critical point that Charles Manson did not personally kill any of the 7 victims in these 2 incidents. However, he was convicted because he ordered his followers to commit the murders. His control and manipulation were central to the prosecution's case. The recent hearing was Patricia Krenwinkel's 16th appearance before a parole board. Each hearing represents a review of her suitability for release after decades in prison. This is the second time a parole board has recommended her for release. The first such recommendation occurred in 2022. Krenwinkel did not speak during the recent hearing. The proceedings lasted approximately 4 hours. Her legal representation and potentially others spoke on her behalf or presented evidence. The parole board's decision is not final. It is subject to a mandatory review process. The ultimate authority to approve or deny parole for inmates convicted of murder in California rests with the state's governor. The current governor is Gavin Newsom. Governor Newsom previously reviewed Krenwinkel's case. He rejected her parole recommendation in 2022. In his 2022 decision, Governor Newsom cited specific concerns. He stated that Krenwinkel continued to pose an unreasonable danger to society if released. Governor Newsom's 2022 rejection also noted aspects of Krenwinkel's acceptance of responsibility. He observed that while she accepted responsibility for her direct actions in the crimes, she appeared to shift a disproportionate amount of blame onto Charles Manson. This suggested to the governor a potential lack of full insight into her own culpability. Opposition to Patricia Krenwinkel's release remains strong and vocal. The most prominent opponents are the surviving family members of the victims. The Tate family, in particular, has consistently and vehemently opposed parole for any of the Manson family members involved in the murders. Sharon Tate's sister, Deborah Tate, has been a tireless advocate for keeping them incarcerated. Opponents cite several key reasons for their stance. A primary argument centers on Krenwinkel's alleged lack of genuine remorse over the years. Accounts from the trial describe Krenwinkel laughing about the murders in court. Opponents point to this as evidence of a disturbing lack of empathy or remorse at the time. Furthermore, the extreme brutality and gruesomeness of the crimes themselves are central to the opposition. The sheer violence, the number of stab wounds, and the post-mortem mutilation and blood smearing are cited as reasons why the perpetrators should never be released. The lasting trauma inflicted upon the victims' families is also a significant factor. For over 5 decades, these families have lived with the consequences of the Manson family's actions. Each parole hearing forces the families to relive the horrors of 1969. They must actively campaign and present arguments against release, a process described as emotionally draining and painful. Victim advocates often highlight the disparity between the lifetime sentence of grief for the families and the potential for release for the perpetrator. They argue that the punishment should reflect the severity and lasting impact of the crime. The nature of the Manson family cult and Manson's manipulative influence is acknowledged. However, opponents argue that Krenwinkel was a willing and active participant in the violence, not merely a passive bystander. Her admission of stabbing Abigail Folger 28 times is frequently brought up. This specific detail underscores her direct and brutal involvement in the killings. The argument is made that the level of violence demonstrated indicates a profound and dangerous capacity for cruelty. Releasing someone who committed such acts, regardless of how much time has passed, is seen as an unacceptable risk. The concept of rehabilitation versus retribution is central to the parole debate. While Krenwinkel's supporters may point to her behavior in prison, opponents focus on the unforgivable nature of the original crimes. The parole board's decision considers factors like behavior in prison, participation in programs, and expressions of remorse. However, the governor's review can weigh other factors, including the gravity of the crime and public safety concerns. The governor's previous rejection in 2022 highlighted the shifting of blame to Manson as a concern. Opponents argue that true remorse requires full acceptance of one's own agency and responsibility, even within a cult dynamic. The legal framework for parole balances the possibility of rehabilitation with the need for public safety and justice for victims. Cases like Krenwinkel's test the limits of this system. The recommendation now moves to the governor's desk for final determination. This decision will be closely watched by the victims' families, legal experts, and the public. The historical context of the Manson family murders adds another layer of complexity. They represent a pivotal moment in American criminal history, and the fate of those involved continues to resonate. The debate over Krenwinkel's parole recommendation is not just about one individual's sentence. It is also about how society weighs rehabilitation against the severity of past atrocities and the enduring pain of victims' families. The outcome will have significant implications. It will affect the lives of the victims' families, the remaining incarcerated Manson family members, and potentially set a precedent for other long-serving inmates convicted of similarly heinous crimes. The governor's decision will require a careful consideration of all factors. These include the parole board's assessment, the legal standards for parole, the historical context of the crimes, and the powerful objections raised by the victims' families. The process underscores the difficult balance inherent in the justice system. It must address past harms while also considering the potential for change and the safety of the community. For the victims' families, the recommendation for parole is a painful reminder of their loss. Their continued advocacy highlights the long-term impact of violent crime. The legal analysis of the case involves examining the criteria for parole eligibility in California. It also considers how those criteria are applied in cases of extreme violence and notoriety. The historical perspective places the crimes within the social and cultural context of the late 1960s. It examines how the Manson family phenomenon developed and the impact it had on the nation's psyche. Ultimately, the decision rests with the governor. His review will determine whether Patricia Krenwinkel, after 54 years in prison, will be granted release or remain incarcerated. The public discourse surrounding this case reflects ongoing societal debates. These debates concern crime and punishment, the nature of evil, the possibility of redemption, and the rights and needs of victims. The recommendation for parole is a procedural step. The governor's decision is the critical next phase in this long and painful legal saga.